Welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am Pastor Dave.
I am Recovering Heretic Dan.
And we are back. Hi, Dan.
Yes. Hi, Dave. How are you today?
Good.
Now that we are back. You know, I've dreamed of this moment. Getting us to the point.
I get you, yes.
Today's reading is all about Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Tempted to sing Dream On by Aerosmith there, but I won't.
And Gary writes Dreamweaver.
Yeah, Dreamweaver. Right.
Yeah.
We could have fun with this.
We could have a lot of fun. Anyway, so our topic, because of Joseph, dreams. Dreams in the Bible, dreams in ancient culture. Just a dreamy conversation today all around.
Yes.
So let us start with the big overall question of all this, and then we'll get down into the details.
Yeah.
But why is it today, dreams are just dreams. They're just, memory dumps, processing, the day's activities.
Yeah.
At best, if we have any meaning at all, it's a Freudian kind of analysis type of thing. So outside of psychoanalysts, why do we not have much import on dreams versus why were dreams so important to biblical peoples?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure they're not any less important per se. Maybe in a little bit. We do tend to psychoanalyze them more because psychology is a science we have that the ancient world didn't. Like Freud wasn't around yet, right? I mean, they just didn't think psychoanalytically about stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's part of the reason, and we do. So that's part of our information. We also just live in a world that's less mystical. Everything has a kind of rational explanation, and so we tend not to jump to the mystical conclusion. But, I mean, we're not all that far away from the movie Inception, right, which is an entire movie about using dreams to change somebody's basic fundamental reality of who they are, right? And we're not, and I think everybody probably has an experience or two of having a dream that feels oddly real, and everybody has another experience of a dream or so where you wondered whether there was some meaning to it, So I don't think we're all that far removed from it. We just also live in a less mystical world, and we live in a more psychoanalytical world because that's a piece of our information that we have that they didn't.
So why did they put so much importance on it and automatically jump to it's a time of divine messages?
Well,
was it just ignorance? Or?
No, I don't know if it's just ignorance, but they can certainly feel that way, right? You can certainly wonder if there's greater otherworldly meaning to them very quickly. I don't know if it's. I wouldn't attribute it to ignorance, or at least I would wonder who was more ignorant, right? Are we more ignorant for being less mystical, or are they more ignorant for being so mystical about it? I would question that, and so I wouldn't attribute it either way to ignorance. I would attribute it just to difference. The ancient Egyptians had whole books devoted to these are what your dreams mean, kind of thing, and so it was a science for them in a certain way, interpreting dreams.
Well, that gets us into, the very fact that the Egyptians, for example, had whole texts.
Right.
Why is that did the Bible just borrow from the Egyptians? Why does the Bible, we have the two Josephs, Joseph, the carpenter, the father figure, who is visited and given messages and dreams. We have obviously this Joseph,
right?
From the Old Testament, and there are other incidences,
Daniel, that kind of thing,
where the dreams are these vehicles for divine messaging. Why does the Bible go in that direction versus with Abraham, where God just comes? Hi, I'm here, let's have lunch.
Yeah, he comes at one point, but there's another story where he comes in a dream to Abraham too, so Abraham gets both versions.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's like, what's that? in the dream, God's just too busy. So it's like the equivalent of texting. I can't make it, but here's.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it is, right? Maybe it's right. It's busy creating new pocket galaxy. Must
But wanted to remind you.
But wanted to remind you. Please be aware of your mission and calling. Could be it. I don't know why. In a certain level, Egyptian culture influences Israelite culture kind of naturally, right? They're the largest superpower in the region. If you believe the biblical account, they spent 400 years in Egypt, so you'd be shocked if there wasn't some cultural borrowing going on there, right? Just nature of the business, and we see that there's a whole psalm, forget which psalm it is, but it's written very much like in the Egyptian sun hymn, except transpose it to Yahweh. You see that with Egyptian stuff occasionally.
And that makes sense. I mean, you think about how much the Babylonian captivity influenced.
Right. How much the Babylonians
changed outright Israel.
Changed Israel, again, they were in...
And that was what, like a generation, 2 generations versus 400 years?
70 years versus, right, so 2.5 generations, and right, and this was 400 years. So you'd kind of, it's part of the landscape, right? And again, Israel is an off-again, on-again vassal state of Egypt through most of its history, basically.
So you've got double the influence possibly going on.
Right, so, it's not surprising that you find some cultural overlap there,
Yeah.
So
what about, the dreams themselves then? Why? I'm going back to stuff that you've taught us before, where we didn't really have this in written form until around the Babylonian captivity period.
Yeah.
Up until then, there were these narratives that
for
were
a lot
verbal.
of it, not all of it, but for a lot of it. But
And so that gives opportunity for a lot of changes. Of course, you change for your audience as time goes on. The game of phone tag, of telephone, and I know at the time, these types of stories that we have with Joseph of the sibling betrayal, hard times, then the betrayed sibling makes good, and there's some kind of reconciliation. That was a hugely popular genre of story back in those ancient days.
Yeah.
Why does the Joseph version of that, before we even get to that, why would that genre of story be so popular in the ancient world? Particularly, Egypt had several stories like this. Other Mesopotamian civilizations did. Why? What was big about that kind of tale?
It feels good, right? Just kind of on a basic human level, right? The brother who gets betrayed and then could lord it over his brothers, but gets to reconcile. There's a reason there's a hit musical about it, right? It feels good, kind of at the end.
Although it's interesting that even then, in what we consider a very violent time, a tale of forgiveness is so important across all those cultures.
Yeah, I think I would say there's certain base human instincts, and I think humans yearn for reconciliation kind of across time and culture, it's just a fundamental yearning we have. Part of it in Genesis is it's meant, or this isn't for sure, but I like this reading of it in that it's meant to mirror the Cain and Abel story. So Genesis begins with this story of brother killing brother, but ends on this story of brother forgiving brother, and so there's this, despite all the mess that has happened through sin, we see a change in how God is working in the world, through this family. And
so it's like a cultural hero's journey.
Yeah, right. And that we're not always fated to be, yes, sin is in the world, but we are not always fated to be Cain and Abel, because God works in the world. And because God works despite our intentions, we can have a different ending than Cain and Abel had.
Yeah.
You know.
So with that, is this actually meant to be more of a fable to give us a message, or is it supposed to have more of a historical base, or is it simply a literary device to give us a background to set up the Exodus story?
I mean, sort of.
All of the above.
All of the above. Well, the trick is, where has it been edited and redacted? You know, what was it
originally versus...
Yeah, where has it been edited and redacted? You know, I would think of like 37 through 50. One scholar calls it the Joseph novella. You know, so think of it as its own. I mean, it's literally from chapter 37 to chapter 50 to the end is Joseph.
Yeah.
You know, and so...
And again, that dovetails with the popularity of that kind of story.
Right. And so, you know, it's not like it's broken up with other stories. It's like, no, this is the whole Joseph narrative, you know.
Complete.
Yeah. And so it's not like Abraham where you get, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah punctuated in there and things like, you know, it's this Joseph narrative that exists.
It's like our main feature presentation.
Right. Yeah. And so I would think of it as its own work. I would think of it as its own coherent work. It is partially setting up. There is material in there that's setting up, obviously, Exodus, because Exodus is like the focal miracle for the Old Testament. You know, it's the focal meaning story for the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
So
it's where Judaism becomes
Judaism. Right. So it's setting up. It is setting up for that in the same way that everything after that is kind of commentary on that,
yeah.
Right? You know, so similar thing, you know, in that regards. Whether it's historical or not is kind of, most scholars would probably say no. I would say we probably don't have enough information, you know. You know, it's hard to know what period we're even talking about here, which is what makes it doubly difficult. You know, like, are we, you know, is this New Kingdom Egypt? Is this Middle Kingdom? You know, like what? There's a traditional timeline, and according to that traditional timeline, it doesn't fit, you know, but could we be talking about some other thing? You know, it's hard to know.
Yeah.
So I would say it's a novella that looks very stage-like, you know, kind of like I describe it the same way I describe Exodus, in that it's a play, it's a drama that probably has a kernel of historical accuracy somewhere tucked away in there, but we don't know more than that, you know. Differentiating between the drama and the historical accuracy is kind of a fool's errand.
So, I've read one biblical scholar that felt that Exodus was basically a Mesopotamian version of the Arthurian, in that we know fairly certain there was a war chieftain named Arthur,
right,
that helped defend against the Saxon
the
invasion.
battle is a real left. The battle is a real battle.
But all this other stuff came out of that.
Right.
This researcher feels that Moses, same thing.
Yeah.
Some base incident that happened, and then it got.
Well, and there's I've heard different theories. One theory I heard recently that I kind of like is that the Levites were the only ones that were actually enslaved in Egypt, and the other 12 tribes were. See, in the ancient world, Israelite and Hebrew are two different categories. Hebrew is a sociological category. It's for riffraff, the lower caste, you know, basically.
I did not know that.
And Israelites are those descendant of Jacob.
So the higher caste.
Well, no, just literally the people, you know, of Jacob's line, right?
Okay.
You know, like that become this people group. Anyway, so one theory I read, and this is just a theory, but it would make sense to me, that the Levites were actually the ones, because Moses is a Levite, Aaron is a Levite. The Levites were the ones actually enslaved in Egypt. And then they got freed, but that's a much smaller group than the millions of people described.
Yeah.
And then they wandered into the Holy Land at about the same time as basically a Hebrew uprising, this lower caste uprising was happening in Canaan, and the two groups merged, and it became everybody's story. But things like that,
That matches the genetic history a little better.
Could work, again, we just don't know. So it's drama.
Yeah.
But it's drama, I would say, with probably something that happened there. It's just hard to tell in the recesses of history.
I'm going to go with Joseph. I'm going to go with feasible.
Yeah.
Just because, and it's hard to know, again, like you said, without knowing really what Egyptian dynasty is it taking place in.
Right.
Because there were dynasties where the Egyptian government did bring in a lot of outsiders, your expertise and ability. They wanted to run the bureaucracy well, so if you were skilled,
right. Well,
didn't matter if you were native.
There's a whole period of Egyptian history where the entire northern half of the country is ruled by Semitic peoples, and so is this in that period? Yeah. It's hard to know. It's right. It's feasible. Just again, Egyptian history is so old and so long, it's hard to know where we're talking about.
Well, just a quick side note, because you mentioned Semitic peoples, is that when the brothers are debating what to do, and they talk about just selling Joseph to the Ishmaelites.
Right.
I assume from things you've commented earlier, these are descended from Ishmael, the other son of Abraham.
Yeah.
So does that mean in today's terms, these were the ancestors of today's Arabs?
Yeah, they're probably talking Arab trader, proto-Arab traders. Yeah. Yes.
Like Bedouins who would routinely travel between the two areas.
Yeah. That kind of culture. Okay. Yes.
God, love the tapestry of detail. Comes through actual history.
Yeah.
Before we move on, Renee has a quick question. Since we've been talking so much about the Old Testament, did Luther comment on the Old Testament stories, or was his focus almost solely on the New Testament?
Luther's actually an Old Testament scholar before he's anything else.
Oh, wow.
That's actually what
that's what he was hired for?
It's actually his first doctorate was in Psalms, I think. Yeah, that's what he was first hired to lecture on, was Psalms. And then he moves on to Romans, but he's actually an Old Testament. I actually think to get Luther, you've got to get that he's an Old Testament scholar, before he's a pastor or reformer or any of that other stuff. He's actually an Old Testament scholar first.
So what were his views on stuff like this, on how historically accurate it may be versus
he thought it was kind of like most, he's pre-modern, right, he's pre-historical criticism, we call it. So, he thinks it's all
literal truth.
literal. And even when it's not literal, he thinks Luther's allergic to diving into allegorical. A big method in the medieval world was the allegorical meaning of the text, and Luther thought that always got you in these strange places talking about purgatory and things like that, and so he was always like, just ignore the plain meaning of the text is always Luther's main thing, not quite a literal reading, but to this day, Lutherans will be like, we'd prefer a plain reading rather than a very complicated one.
Okay. So Dan Brown just would not be a fan of Lutherans generally.
No, right. Yeah, no. Yes, that is. And neither are Lutherans a fan of Dan Brown. So it's a mutual loathing, Yeah.
Okay.
So
I don't know if Renee, did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he's an Old Testament scholar. So, yeah, I think it was Psalms and Isaiah or something like that is what he was originally hired to lecture on. So,
and you mentioned in your sermon today about Joseph came along a little later, and that kind of makes me wonder, going again off track with the dream stuff, but What is this thing with the Bible and senior citizens having kids? It seems to recur over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And in this case, he already had plenty of kids, so why?
Yeah, well, so Jacob's, his thing is a little different. Jacob's married to two women, Leah and Rachel. Mm-hmm. And Rachel, he actually loves. Leah, he doesn't actually like.
Was Leah more of an arranged marriage then, or?
Leah's father, Leah and they're sisters. Mm-hmm. So Leah and Rachel's father tricked Jacob into marrying Leah first.
Okay.
It's a rather funny story, and you kind of come out of it going, wait, what? But it's a funny story.
Her father wasn't named Baal by chance, Baal Organa?
No, right. Yeah, right. No, it's so he tricks Jacob. There's this whole piece of the Jacob narrative, which is its own large chunk of Genesis, of Jacob's going back and forth with his father-in-law, and they're both these con men, basically, and so they're always in this competition to see who can con more out of the other, But he tricks Jacob into marrying the oldest one first, and then he marries Rachel, who's the younger sister, who he actually loves.
So this is the origin of sister wives.
Yeah, sort of, and so the narrative goes that God gives Leah, the unloved one, the bulk of the children, because she is unloved. It says God saw Leah and had compassion on her in her plight. And so 10 of the 12 sons are born to the unloved wife, including, if you read, this is where Jesus' genealogy is actually important, right? Jesus is descended from Judah, not from Joseph. And so Jesus is descended from the unloved one,
Okay.
But
an interesting distinction on that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the main character is Joseph, but actually both King David and Jesus come from Judah, not from Joseph's line. So, but eventually it says Rachel doesn't have any kids after a while, and eventually the Bible says, and God noticed Rachel too, and so she has two kids, Joseph first, and then she dies in childbirth with Benjamin, the youngest. So that's a little different. That's the Jacob story. That's just he has two wives and they have lots of kids.
Yeah.
Okay. There is this theme from Abraham through the whole family, and it's a persistent theme even past that, of infertility. In the ancient world, if you didn't have an heir of your own blood, they didn't really believe in an afterlife, right? So the way God's promises were continually made true was through an heir of your own blood, or somebody of your family to continue on these promises that were made to you, And this is why Abraham protests to God initially, that says, well, all I've got is Eliezer, my servant. It doesn't matter if you make promises to me, I'm going to die, and
Eliezer gets everything, and he's not of my blood.
Right, and he's not of my blood. So there's this problem. So it's a problem of hopelessness, right? Without an heir, there is no future. So, and without future, right, you're hopeless and in despair.
So, what there is of you is just gone now.
It's just gone. And so there's this issue of hope, right, which is found in this expression of, can I have a kid or not? And God's always working hope in the midst of hopeless situation, and so that's persistently happening for this family, and it's kind of to show, part of it is to show that it's not like these people had fertility treatments, that it's not like they went for a technical fix.
Yeah.
And
there's
that's all.
No IVF, no.
Right. Well, and it's beyond IVF, right? Like they're literally beyond fertility at this point, and so when you beyond all of man's devices, all human technology, all human capacity, then God steps in And they express that via this old age thing,
Okay.
On a realistic scientific level, infertility is usually passed through the male. It's often genetic and is passed through the male line, actually not the female line, usually. And so there's this, it would make sense that this line of men is persistently struggling with fertility issues, because Isaac has the same problem at first, and so it would kind of make sense that again and again we see this line of men struggle with this,
Yeah.
So
we have both message and just plain genetics as to why
right.
it keeps recurring in
It
the
actually
Bible.
fits scientifically that this family would persistently struggle with this problem. And theologically, it's making a point about how God is worshipped and things like that, and how God shows up.
Well, we got just a couple of minutes left.
Okay.
I mean, it's went really fast. So back to the dreaming. Why did the attitude towards Joseph change so radically when the Egyptian hierarchy found out that he could interpret dreams so well? So like you mentioned, they already had textbooks about this, about interpreting dreams. So why would Joseph stand out so much and his fortune turn around so quickly with them?
The best explanation I have for it is it's kind of like finding an economic forecaster who's usually right. Like the president has these economic forecasters, right? And like the ones who are good at it stick around and have the ear of the president, right? Because he's trying to figure out what to do with the kingdom, the country in this case. But that's the best way I have to compare it. It's like they're basically Pharaoh's council of economic advisors, but he does it through dreams instead of statistical data, And actually, I would kind of, given the way economic forecasting models work, I would kind of argue, are dreams any better or worse than the way it currently works, right?
Yeah. Our subconscious may be processing the data better than...
Right. Pull an economist, you'll get 5 different answers, on what the economy is going to do tomorrow, but, and so whether it's an economist or just a special advisor whose voice you trust, he becomes that special advisor to the president equivalent, who you think gives you good advice,
So one final way, or one final question before we sign off. Even given that, how would you then, or even now conceivably, discern between a dream that was a divine message and a dream that was just a wild psychedelic fantasy? How did the ancients do that?
Well, not very well. That's why the people who are good at it stand out, right? Right? The reason they keep saying this about Joseph and Daniel and all, it's like, oh, they're right. They interpret these dreams and they're correct. Holy cow. I guess I would say, this is my constant theme on any message you get from God. You will get no message from God that will contradict Scripture, and specifically contradict the gospel message, the gospel of Jesus Christ. You won't get some message from God that goes, what, works righteousness was correct. That's your subconscious or worse. You won't get a dream that says, write a new book of the Bible.
Well, but hearkening, that's good for us now. Hearkening back to the ancients, before all this was written down, when these stories took place, how would they have discerned?
Simple time and whether he proved right or not.
So trial by fire on all this.
Right. I mean, that's really it.
Okay.
Because, I think, like in the Joseph story, I actually think you see why, Joseph comes up with this vision, right, or this interpretation of the dream, and then he actually has a plan. He doesn't just kind of lay it out there for Pharaoh and be like, there it is, pay me. Like he actually says, well, this is what you should do, if this is really on the horizon,
then here are the steps we must take.
Here's the steps, right? So he's not just giving you a forecast, he's actually solving a problem, and that's kind of true for Daniel too, is, the gift of wisdom is not just in interpreting the dream, but in able to have prudence to plan out for what the dream is saying,
Yeah.
And so, that's where he catches Pharaoh. That's where he catches Pharaoh's eye in the story, right? Is Pharaoh's, oh, dang. He's not just saying this is the problem, but he's got solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, well, go off and do it, which is what I say to people when they say, I have this vision for ministry. I'm like, okay, go do it,
Yeah. I've got a papyrus deck to show you our plan, and as you can see here.
Right, and so it's that part that convinces Pharaoh as much as he has an answer for what the dream means,
Yeah. He saw a bureaucrat in the making right there.
Yeah, I mean, he saw a, second in command of all of Egypt, right? And somebody who could get him through. And if you read that story carefully, it caused a lot of problems too, but that's maybe a different thing for a different.
Yeah, another session topic.
Yeah.
Should be good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, I would like that idea of covering
interesting
the foibles.
There's this interesting material between Genesis 43 and 47 where Joseph's actually in charge of Egypt. It's fascinating how that goes.
Not always to plan.
Yeah. Well, it is to plan, but that's kind of the problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
Well, and that's all the time we have for today, but that's coolness.
Yes.
And make sure to answer everybody's questions. No, we didn't answer Keith's questions, so I think we have a whole nother session coming up.
We can answer whatever questions.
Write them down.
Keith
submit
has
them
my
in
phone number.
triplicate.
Keith can text me his questions.
And just a reminder, you can always send us questions anytime. Comment on our YouTube channel. Send us an email. Was it your Pastor Dave at relc.org?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Just send it that way, or comment on the live version. But however you do it, we're always open to your questions.
Yep.
Doesn't have to be on theme.
Yep.
In the meantime, have a grand 2 weeks. You're off next week, right?
Yes, I am off next week.
All right, so we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
See you, folks.